Thank you very much, Sean. I think first and foremost, I must thank you for the incitement to come back to Notre Dame. It was such an incitement that I could not refuse. But I think it's also a very happy incitement to meet so many colleagues, friends, and very many of my former teachers too. I can understand that when you're the first in anything, you're going to be constantly used as a sort of timeline for something. So I take that as a compliment in many ways, and I'm glad that the LLM program's matured since I was here. So you might notice from the title of what I'm trying to say, there are two words there, in transition, and I have a question mark. And then this goes directly to very many of the things that we've been talking about so far, and incited directly by Professor Peter Walsh's question yesterday about where are we going? And the notion of transitional justice itself is the framework that I use to try and make some kind of contribution to where socio-economic justice in South Africa is really going. I do that in a very modest kind of way because I don't have all the answers. I certainly have a number of questions. So if I was going to frame very quickly in an abstract kind of way, what was I trying to say? I had some degree of difficulty myself with this because I'm not too sure what I'm trying to say. Am I saying that South Africa is in transition? And if it is, where is it transitioning to? What does its constitution allow it to do? And then if you remember the early discussion on transitional justice in South Africa that Garth introduced us to, when he got to the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, he mentioned the three committees, but when he got to the Reparations Committee, he said it was rubbish. Now, is that enough for me? Because I think if it is rubbish, it has a very large impact on our society. So the questions I'm asking is, does the post-transitional justice phase of 22 years, now I'm taking since 1994, after the advent of freedom, provide us with an appropriate time to reflect on any potential that's realized or any opportunity that's missed? That's more or less why I'm pitching my ideas. And I'm arguing to a certain extent that the planned and sustained implementation of socio-economic rights is, as a part of the transition of South Africa, is essential. Now, I'm not leaving it to the courts only. I'm not leaving it to the TRC process either. I'm asking some fundamental questions about what is the content of socio-economic rights, and it's part of our constitutional menu of options, should we put it that way in broad terms. We have a receptive court that's willing to listen to such claims. But how much can a court really do? That's another point. So even institutional protections of such rights yield what I will call slow progress through legal precedents, and this may therefore result in what I'm calling an incomplete transition. But for us to talk about a transition as being incomplete, how long does it take for a transition to complete? And if a country has been subjected to more than 350 years of oppression, and at what point do we say, okay, the signal comes up, oppression's over, and we are now free. We've transitioned, okay? It's clear enough, I think, from very many presenters that the post-apartheid South Africa requires a deliberate policy of social justice through mainstreaming of socio-economic rights to address the injustices of the past. Now, that's a big, broad statement, and you can make that any time, and you are fine. Your students won't really tackle you on it. But I'm trying to put this back into the transitional justice framework, which essentially speaks of violations of civil and political rights. And the emphasis is on criminal prosecutions, for those who didn't ask for amnesty. But all of that transitional justice process discountenances the debilitating effects of socioeconomic disempowerment. So to understand this, we speak sometimes of post-conflict situations. And I'll try to see if I can unpack that for South Africa. But the South African Transitional Justice, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, focused on violations of human rights from the 1st of March 1960, which the Commission interpreted to exclude economic and social rights violations. And this is arising mainly from the kinds of economic social violations I think Garth was referring to, of forced removals, of discrimination in education, Bantu education, of employment, education, and employment opportunities that arise from that kind of education. The Job Reservation Act. And then perhaps I thought to myself, was 1960 the right type of time to actually push it back to? Would 1913 not be a more appropriate date? Because then we have the major dispossession that took place in South Africa, which is land itself. And that dispossession underpins very many of the socio-economic rights questions that we are still talking about. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had the Human Rights Committee, the Amnesty Committee, and the Reparations Committee. Before you arrived, Garth, I said, your assessment of Reparations Committee was rubbish. Now, I'm not sure that's fair to the TRC process itself, but the Reparations Commission did, in fact, award nominal sums of money to victims as the TRC process unfolded. But I'll come back to that about what was the claim, what did they want? So what form of reparations victims wanted in the Truth and Reconciliation system in South Africa? I would call them classical economic, social, and cultural rights. Right? They wanted treatment for health. They wanted education for their children. They wanted housing or employment. These are all Article 11 requirements of an adequate standard of living found in the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. To the best of my knowledge, and perhaps there are better experts over here than myself on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission systems around the world, in South Africa certainly, I heard no one ask for more freedom of expression or fair trial rights. I'm not sure if the others did in fact reveal that. The point I'm making is very simple. The claim was not for more civil and political rights. The claim is always about economic, social, and cultural rights. So if South Africa was then put into a kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission system, it must have been a post-conflict society, right? Because that's when TRC systems plug in rather neatly. But what kind of post-conflict society was South Africa? So post-conflict societies usually turn to transitional justice as a mechanism of dealing with the past, to seek to uncover the truth, and to hold the perpetrators accountable, and to foster reconciliation, we've been told, initiate institutional reform, and secure reparations for victims of past abuses. And it was asked from the audience, would some of these, certainly Garth mentioned to us, that some of these matters were completely dismissed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We will not go back there because that's not something we can really fix very early in the TRC process. I'm arguing that apartheid itself is not just an ordinary conflict, as we understand conflicts to be. In fact, it is a sustained pattern of behavior imposed on a group of people for a period of time, what we would call a colonial project. And this colonial project creates what I call latent conflict through its laws and its policies and practices that dispense essentially goods and services, social and economic benefits, largely to the white minority, while disenfranchising the African population. Now that will take my first statement about transition into another zone. And I think it locates very clearly Professor Walsh's question to us yesterday. How are we going to talk about transitioning if we're not going to attend to these various obvious issues that are confronting our society? And he mentioned yesterday to us the Native Land Act, the Black Administration Act, the Group Areas Act, for example. And these acts literally confined the African population to the margins of socio-economic life in South Africa and ever since. So the policy of Bantustans themselves created an education system which is designed to create an African population of labor force that's educated sufficiently enough to be exploited in the service of the system, but not sufficiently enough to aspire to any career advancement beyond the lowest echelons. Now, if that's the history from which South Africa comes from, and our Truth and Reconciliation Commissions dealt with largely the kinds of civil and political rights, as I would call them in broad terms, what does transitional justice mean in South Africa? And if it means something a little bit more than I'm trying to posit, what is it? From what we saw, that only a handful of perpetrators who were working for the apartheid regime were punished for their crimes. And we were told that in the next 30 years, this is likely to re-emerge as a major issue. But there are different views as to whether or not that this compromise had actually facilitated true reconciliation or undermined accountability. We're not too sure. In a lecture that Ben Okri gave in Cape Town, he rhetorically asked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He asked the question, has there been reconciliation without proper consideration? That sounds like a fairly regular question to ask. But he asked it in the context of South Africa. And he asked in a Steve Biko lecture whether this transition, as I am talking about, has been completed or not, and what were the conditions under which we had negotiated them. Now, I say that 22 years after the end of apartheid, the statistics are pretty stark. Black South Africans have the highest figures in poverty, unemployment, illiteracy, disease, and a range of a number of other indices. In fact, the only area in which it's dropped by South African statistics data is in poverty levels, where it's dropped by 12%. But largely using any other index in South Africa, including access to land, or even access to education, let's say tertiary education, university like this, the proportionality is still largely weighted against the group that was previously disadvantaged. And South Africa is characterized by frequent what we call service delivery protests. You might have heard this language. I got back to South Africa after 9 years in Ireland, and when I came back they told me it was a service delivery protest. I was a bit confused by that. What service delivery and why are they protesting? They were protesting about the lack of rubbish being picked up. Okay? Still in Johannesburg we've got a bit of a problem with that. There's not enough sanitation. There's no education. Our children still are being educated under trees. There's none of the socio-economic rights as protected in the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. There's no adequate standard of living. Now, how can that be service delivery, I asked myself. Well, that's management speak. When you put management speak over the failure to deliver human rights, then you make it understandable. And the way I actually explain this to my own students is, you make it understandable because we know that the ANC has an employment system of patronage. Okay? So you're not expecting any manager to be competent because they're deployed in that position. And because we don't expect deployment to have any level of finesse, we expect failure. Therefore, we get accustomed to failure. But in fact, they are violations of socio-economic rights contained in the very constitution that we talked about. And this is holding accountability at the point where it makes a difference, where we talk about how can we transition from there if we're not being able to deliver sanitation services. A child drowned or died in a toilet pit. Okay? The level of tragedy around this is still stark and real. The only thing that we've really found is our voice to express that. I try to speak about South Africa in other kinds of ways. When I speak about the progress that we made in human rights, I can recall that rape was one of the most heinous crimes ever, in my definition and most people's definition. In South Africa today, we are quite relieved when there is a rape survivor. because we think, oh my gosh, she's not dead. So it's a case of now we're looking at things in a more accepting way of failing rights entrenchment, is one way to see it. But the rape example really doesn't fit too well on socio-economic rights. I'm asking, after 22 years, and I use the example of 22 years because somehow 21 is the rite of passage once was. Since the UN told us it's now 18, we've changed our mind, but 21 once was the rite of passage for adulthood, right? Would 22 be sufficient for, let's say, a state to now assess whether it's making any kind of progress in its transitioning from its old practices to the new one? So I would caution against the service delivery protest, which are actually failures to enforce socioeconomic rights. Then I thought, rather than just being critical about this, there are one or two states that have actually acted in a particular direction in this. Iraq would not be a good example because it's not really achieved much, but it's one of those countries. But perhaps the Ministry of Transformation and Reconciliation in South Africa, tasked with addressing these fundamental human rights violations in a holistic way, arising from the pernicious practice of apartheid, might be one way to address the void. But I call for this Ministry of Transformation and Reconciliation. We don't have joined up thinking in South Africa. We've got a lot of people doing a lot of work and in various ministries, but they in fact don't think about the larger direction in which we want as a society to move with the values that are contained in the Constitution. I think the skeleton is there. It requires some deep fleshing out. So what is the traditional content of transitional justice as we know it to be? Criminal justice origins of transitional justice because of the idea of justice being seen as the main issue of fixing some harm done to a person. The South American examples would be people who disappear, at least let us know where they are. But what do you do with the exclusion of social, economic, and cultural rights? And there are schools of thoughts on this, some who say now you cannot proceed in transitional justice ever without including socio-economic rights. But there are also people like Lars Waldorf, others who speak of the fact that they are wary of efforts to have transitional justice tackle historically constructed socio-economic inequalities. So why are they wary of it? Because they say it will cost too much money. And they're also concerned about the fact that this will have an impact in another. In other words, it's too difficult a task. I ask, how difficult? What will be the outcome if we don't tackle difficult tasks? The problem won't go away. It might just be that we fail to address it sooner. So these kinds of economic approaches to developmental questions is something that human rights people come across all the time. And Amartya Sen was the one who actually clarified that for us and said that essentially that a development question was a human rights question, because without that you would have unfreedoms, the failure to have rights. So I think a human rights-based approach to the way in which we are tackling the unfinished business, if I can call it that now, in socioeconomic rights is fundamentally important. The victims of past abuses demand processes that would, but not discounting the past, enable them to transcend the past through socioeconomic capacitation. But we've got a number of these from labor, we've got the level of, let's say, the Ministry of Economics, but do we have a plan that actually pulls right through a range of these departments? For apartheid, there is a reverse factor that's true. The only real item on the agenda for apartheid, as far as I understand it to be, was economic subjugation and economic dispossession, not political. For me, the political expulsion was only a means to the end of being able to get to the economic advantage. So, the Office of the High Commissioner recently has been making more statements about this, and the UN Office talks about transitional justice can contribute to the fight against impunity for violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, and to their prevention by laying the foundation for forward-looking reforms and agendas. Now that sounds like very good policy. when our own country, after now 22 years of democracy, are not actually getting to the point where they should be with regard to the entrenchment of these very important matters, then I think we've got a bit of a problem. Some of the more recent socioeconomic statistics between 2006 and 2011 given to us by the Statistics South Africa on poverty trends indicate the following: that 9 out of 10 South Africans who were poor were black. And this represents an increase from 92.9% in 2006 to 94.2% in 2011. So it's rising. This is the highest amongst the different racial groups in South Africa. But at the point at which we were attempting to dismantle apartheid, if you're starting in 1994 and in 2011 you're still in the 90%, 94%, progress is completely missing, is one description. So by 2014, the unemployment amongst black South Africans stood at 40%, against the highest by the population group, compared to 28% for coloureds, 18% amongst Indians or Asians, and 8% amongst whites. So again, the group that was previously disadvantaged remains in that zone. I was told, by the way, that these are not startling figures. I was told by somebody else who heard a bit of my discussion. He said, in the US, after 100 years, we've had the same figures. I can't be accepting of that particular statistic. That's a cop-out, right? I need to ask what is happening in the country where this was the major problem, okay? There are similar results that I talked about in land and other means of production, access to adequate housing, for example, matters that are seized by the Constitutional Court around this, healthcare, higher education, and in higher education, now that I am a manager of such an institution, you might have heard of the phenomenon of fees must fall. I have students demonstrating, and it's a real issue. I can tell you of a particular story that I shared with my colleagues on the first day, and I thought that I knew how to run a law school because I can work out budgets, I can tell you how many students I'm going to get, what's the income as against the expenditure, right? And we can work out all of those things. And on a Friday afternoon, a student came to me and said, I don't have any money for fees. Would you be able to assist? And we have been helping people recently as best as we could. So as a bureaucrat, I said, yeah, do a budget. Show me what your income and expenditure is like, and we'll see what you can do about this on Monday. Just bring it to me. And on Monday, she didn't arrive, but there was a large wailing in the passageway to the entrance of my office. And her mother arrived with a piece of paper crumpled in her hands. And all she said to me, she tried to commit suicide. This is a young, vibrant, good student, 24 years old, who thought it was all too much. Not just coming to university, which is one of the hurdles, and the fees for that, but the other hurdles. The house was being repossessed. All the furniture was already taken away by the people that were owed money. They got far too many bits and pieces from the neighbors. They have 2 fridges, but probably no stove. But this is the nature of altruism. You can't actually have a shopping list when you ask for help. The bottom line on this is that this student thought at 24, and bright at that too, that it was all too much, because included in that was the fact that her mother was a rape survivor. And the mother would speak about this in public. And at this particular point in this young person's life, she thought it was better to check off the planet than to face it. What does that have to do with the law school? Everything. So if I'm thinking that I'm in the business of educating younger people so they might become lawyers, I've missed the point completely. And the socioeconomic questions in her life were stark, such that it would help her take those actions. I was very angry. I think I was angry with myself. I picked up the phone and called her on her cell phone and said she should come up to university immediately, almost in a very brusque way. Because at the back of my mind was the notion of, young woman has attempted suicide once, there's a chance of doing it again the second time. But if she came in and registered, she would have reason to live. Whether I got that right or wrong, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll return someday and tell you whether it's turned out to be a good news story or not. So when we talk of these socioeconomic statistics, we need to keep it in some level of realism, I think. There's talk about participation in management positions in corporate South Africa, and even in academia, which is in fact highly misrepresentative of the kind of the population groups themselves. My own law school is still 60% white. I'm the first black dean in 92 years, black male dean. So we have serious challenges. My law school is well endowed generally, so we can from time to time fish in the part of our budget and be able to assist a student or two. But is that enough? These types of transitions have been described by Patrick Bond when he was quoting Kandawira as choiceless democracy, where there is an inability to change the parameters of socioeconomic realities. Naomi Klein, in her particular book, talks about these types of governance systems as being a bit of figment of our imagination, because democracy means being given the keys to the door to government, but not the keys to the vault where the money is. So the issue of finances and where the access is to that is fundamentally important for any kind of progress that we might make on socioeconomic rights. There needs to be a shift in the paradigm from one that seeks transitional processes without a transformative change. We have to look now towards transformative justice, which is something that Kath Collins in the University of Ulster has been talking about more recently. Then there are other statistics that are fundamentally important, because you're going to say to me, Vinodh, if we open up this kind of socioeconomic issues, then clearly there's the matter of money. We can't afford it. Well, I think a key aspect of the new kind of agenda for this ministry that I'm talking about would be to staunch this kind of hemorrhaging of state funds. Because our Auditor General, Kimi Makweta, reported that in 2013-2014, that 62.7 billion rand was lost to irregular expenditure. That is equivalent of $4.5 billion or thereabouts in my quick calculation in the plane. It could be up to $5 billion. This is irregular expenditure. There's wasteful expenditure of about 2.6 billion. And the worst offenders of all these wasteful expenditures are from the departments that are in charge of the most essential public services, the most essential socioeconomic rights: health, education, human settlement, and in public works. So if they are losing the money, then we have not much chance of making the progress that we want. But if that 62 billion rand was available, then it's not costly to bring some radical change, I think, in our socioeconomic planning. The pursuit of social justice, when we see economic, social, and cultural rights and transformation in South Africa, the pursuit of social justice as an end using the state apparatus is constructed in a political economy is fundamental for a development state. I think that we are that kind of development state, but we are a little bit lost and probably lagging in that space, and what I think Peter Walsh called disillusionment with governance in South Africa. But governance around socioeconomic issues are fundamentally out of kilter, we would say. The Section 26 of our Constitution, a well-acclaimed judgments have been granted by the Constitutional Court, and they range from the right to housing right through to being able to protect people from creditors who are busy trying to steal the small little houses that they've been given to by the state. And one might say that we have a number of acts that empower us in South Africa to get past these, let's say, the quagmire of the past socioeconomically. The Land Rights Act, for example, is one. But Gibson also speaks about South Africa's big difficulty with land and getting a kind of clear policy out of it. When I think about my own dissertation that I wrote here on the right to land, I can recall being questioned by the examination panel whether this was a pure political thing. The right to land was just about a tokenism. And I argued back to the member of the current panel saying, no, it isn't. It is a necessary part of equality. And not much has changed. That still is very much part of equality, because land would give some access to funds and, or let's say, the opportunity to eke a living out of that. There's a broad-based economic, black economic empowerment, the Prevention of Illegal Eviction and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. There are a number of these particular laws that are likely to assist us. But we have examples, 5 examples only I will use, and I won't go into the detail of them, and maybe we can talk about that. In 2008, one Irene Grootboom died in a shack, 8 years after the Constitutional Court declared her to be entitled to a decent house, she and her family. So we've got a court decision. We just haven't got the implementation right. And in between, we lose a life. This, we've been told by Justice Sachs in his book, The Strange Alchemy of Life and Law, that the Grootboom case, in fact, shows the difficulty of, using the Constitutional Court to redirect the right kind of socio-economic outcome. But for me, it has to be a little bit more than that. For justice to be seen to be done, it will be necessary to calibrate a judicial decision on socio-economic rights with the appropriate executive action. And that's what you've been saying to us, Judge, about the way in which we're responding to court orders. I think there is generally, in some departments, certainly in the former organization that I ran in Lawyers for Human Rights, litigation against the Department of Home Affairs, who constantly flout court orders. In fact, don't even understand them. So I would say that there's a little bit more to be done in that particular space. There is need for the recalibration, no doubt. We have a second example. The second example is something you have heard about. 34 miners were shot dead by policemen in Marikana in August 2012 because they were demanding, they say, decent wages. This is the largest killing by our own police, of our own people, since Sharpeville. Would that be fair, Professor Walsh? And what would make us want to open fire on a group of protesting miners? Okay, except the fact that they might be threatening our lives. And if you saw the videos on this, it's pretty horrific, the way in which we approached with, I think the old word in Afrikaans was kragdadigheid, right? Real power, muscle. The killing of people who are carrying a knobkerrie and a shield made of skin, as if there's a real threat. The details on who's going to be held accountable for that, we're not too sure, if anyone. The third example I'm giving you now is that of the student protests on the decolonization of historically white universities, from staff to the curriculum, whether it started at the University of Cape Town and Rhodes must fall, all the way through the University of Witwatersrand, where you had fees must fall. Now, my students are engaging with me on the curriculum and saying, essentially, where does it reflect African values? Why isn't African customary law taught as a compulsory course? These are all fundamental questions, including the change of the name of the law school building. It's called Oliver Schreiner Law School at the moment, and they want that name to come out, not because Oliver Schreiner was not a good judge, but they said he was a good judge in the past. They would much rather not name the building after a person. But they will leave commemorative spaces within the building for a lot of people that they admire as lawyers. I think these are eminently responsible statements to be made by law students. But in fact, that there is the student demonstration indicates to us from some that there is a finishing of the business that was started in 1976. So it was, again, probably an incomplete transition, if there was a transition. Then the problem was Afrikaans, they said, amongst others. Now it might be just purely the inability to access education. not unlike my student that I told you about, but there are hundreds of similar students in South Africa. There are 4 and 5 are the same types of examples that I'm going to give you. Without trying to justify the acts of xenophobia themselves, twice during the last 22 years, 2008 and 2015, some South Africans have unleashed a barbaric reaction and violence on vulnerable foreign people living in South Africa, perceived to take up their jobs and other economic opportunities. And for me, this is an example of unresolved social and economic questions since 1994, confirmed more recently, just before I left, by Navi Pillai's commission in Natal, in KwaZulu-Natal, where she confirmed that that the uprising, including the king's utterances, who, by the way, didn't subject himself to the Human Rights Commission's call to be held accountable for hate speech. The report's still coming, we've been informed, but please follow that report. So even that, the king didn't want to respond because the king is not supposed to respond. It answers the question about traditional values and where there's the clash between constitutional and other issues. So if this happened once, it's okay. If it happens twice, it means we've missed the point completely. And we're slaughtering people we perceive to be taking our own socio-economic positions. They're taking up our jobs, they say, and the language is very crude and unreconstructed. But the net result is that people, in fact, die. So there are 5 recent events, and I haven't gone into the detail of the 5 recent events. I'm simply using them as a flag. I'm saying to you, if we are transitioning, it's the 5 issues that I'm raising here, are they not an indication of something serious to worry about? Okay? I say South Africa is still a country in transition. Even with the assistance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and even after 22 years, we are still in transition. Alex Borain said that he sees transition as a passing or passage from one condition or action, or really from one place to another. It's a journey never short, often precarious. It's a good definition, I think. But there is a level of impatience that is gnawing at me. And maybe my training as a lawyer says, don't get too emotional about it. But I think some level of emotion is necessary here. Because 22 years after the end of apartheid, some might contend that the transition is not a success. This answers Professor Walsh's question. We haven't transitioned yet. But to do so is to suggest that the transition is already ended. So we don't have a period of time, no bookmarks to be able to measure where we began and where we are ending. Kat Collins, that I referred to earlier on, speaks of post-transitional justice as a distinct frame of analysis that will examine the all-inclusiveness and adequacy of the earlier concessions made in the transitional justice process. And I think the biggest concession South Africa made was to negotiate the power, but not to negotiate the money. In other words, not to negotiate all the people who prefer to trade in South Africa with pension funds in the Northern Hemisphere, growing that at a quick pace at the price of people who are still poor. So without taking kind of a more programmatic approach to addressing socioeconomic deficits, backed by effective implementation of rights, no assessment can be made of when a transition has ended, or even whether it's begun at all. Thank you very much.
Questions from the floor? Vinodh,
Sure.
Thank you very much for a lucid and penetrating analysis. The situation is very difficult, and it involves the relationship between the Supreme Court, Constitutional Court, and Parliament. And the capacity for Parliament to learn from the courts and the courts to listen closely to Parliament would be ideal.
Yes.
The tensions are very real, as you know, how you explained. My question is this. As though it was not difficult enough do people recognize, on the court, for example, that a new black elite has emerged that has been absorbed largely into the corporate structure of South Africa and is not progressive. It's done very well. It may talk about transitional movement, but it's not really committed to it in any serious way. That may be an unfair judgment, but something like that is going on in Parliament. The second problem is that the world scene has changed. In other words, after World War II, after the Great Depression of the 30s, the search for the common good through parliamentary structures which we struggled for generations and centuries to put in place, flowered and moved in the direction of a greater equality and progressive income tax, etc., access to public schooling. You outlined that already. By the late 70s, however, in the aftermath of the Cold War, American corporations and others around the world, but led by America's corporations, in the aftermath of the Cold War, globalization took place, and it involved a massive release of control over the corporations, who have affected our entire economy in the United States, 1% of society owning more than half of its wealth. Now, South Africa is trapped in that too. And my question then is, can Parliament and the Court in the future assess the role of globalized free market economics? Because there is no trickle down of a significant sort to 90% in South Africa and well over 50% in many other countries too. Can the Court work with parliamentary South Africa to wrestle with that international aspect as well?
It's a very key question that you asked. I wish I could answer it quickly. I can't. I think there's no doubt South Africa is part of the globe, and therefore will be caught in globalization. Globalization is touted as a sort of, you can't see it for all our economic ills, and in fact, it's just the opposite, as you well stated. The role of the courts will have to be a little bit more nuanced, because I think the point I'm making on this one is that we have a number of institutions of democracy, where from civil society through to the courts, through to government, through to a range of players here, including an ordinary citizen. That's the approach that I'm taking. And I'm saying that the Ministry of let's say, Transformation and Reconciliation should take up a better position than our current kind of portfolios of governance that imitate colonial thinking. We need some joined-up thinking up here. We need to think across those kinds of departments so that we are able to grow areas that have not actually moved that much since independence. On globalization itself, I think until the matter is ripe in a particular form for the court to be able to see, maybe perhaps it's a labor issue. I'm just trying to guess where that might be. And that's already visible in let's say, in our mining sector, where we've been told more and more often now that the mines are no longer viable. And in Johannesburg, you can go down the mines in Johannesburg up to 2 kilometers into the earth. And the technology comes from my university. But how does that benefit us? Those mines are actually going to close down if it's not profitable. In other words, if it doesn't hit the level of profit making for its shareholders at the international level. What would that do for South Africa's economy? It would kill it, because we are a labor-intensive economy. We need people to be working. We've had recently the trade negotiations between South Africa and the United States, where in return for us selling some of our cars that we manufacture, Mercedes-Benz in East London, we will get dumped with chicken from the United States. And we're very glad for it. At one level. I can see Mary already shaking her head. And we've been told, we're very glad for it because we are happy for the opportunity to work with the United States. We are grateful to be able to feed at that particular trough, if you know what I mean. But on the other hand, we're not too sure if the chicken's, healthy for consumption, because there are a number of concerns about it. That would be a classical example where globalization has now come to the doorstep. Literally, the chickens come home to roost.
I'm also thinking at this particular point of Lesotho, with in fact a growing textile industry,
Yes.
totally undermined
Correct.
by cheap goods coming in from abroad. No capacity to help those people, no foreign aid like Marshall Aid anymore. It's all supposed to happen automatically by the market, and it doesn't. It's a political issue.
And even Marshall Aid was done for a particular purpose, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To grow a market.
But I thank you very much for this, your answer to the first question, which I thought was exactly where we need to start going. We need to start really fundamentally rethinking, and the one thing lawyers are trying to do is think about problems. And we are presented with this global problem of economic inequality that really invites rethinking from more fundamental grounds. I mean, we're now 20 years into accepting the Fukuyamian view that we're at the end of history, that it's all about democracy and capitalist economics, and these two go fundamentally together. And we've had this amazing breakthrough in the form of Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, and in terms of an economic revolution. So maybe that's where it needs to go, to really rethink. You said you have a resource intensive, but the second question you got was about why does a group of people who are successfully making fabrics and creating an economy, why can't we rethink that? I think one of the things the law schools and legal academics like us can think about is what kind of value statements are we setting? Why is it all about having an amazing bank account that's part of the Panama Papers?
Exactly.
Instead, why is that the image of success, and aren't we in legal academy capable of fundamentally challenging people to rethink the definition of success in the context of environment and economy?
No, I think you're correct. My answer to that usually when I did teach Socio-Economic rights is to say to my students, you have a Fortune 500 magazine. You don't have a Miss Fortune 5 million one. And who would buy that one? But that would be more or less the proportion of let's say, people who are disadvantaged by the 500 people who are the richest. And we have a tendency in our societies to create adulation in the wrong spaces.
I just wanted to pick up on the two comments from Peter Welch and Marianne. The field of public interest law, I think, is at a key crossroads. I think if we look at how much energy and effort is going into lawyering for the public interest, we're losing the battle.
That's right.
More and more lawyers are being channeled into serving the market, the interests and the incentives of the market. And we as public interest lawyers need to start to think about how do we reposition ourselves to respond to this reality. Whether it is, the way that legal education is set up to prepare people to go and serve this market and skews them through cost of education, student loans, lack of opportunities to go into public interest, or whether it's the tactics we use and how we fight and engage with corporations. Corporations are the best consumers of legal advice you can get. Civil society needs to be as effective in using legal advice to deal with some of the challenges of corporations, but we're nowhere near that. We're still trying to go to use the same tools we use in fighting against repressive governments to deal with this new phenomenon. And so this is the challenge of our time, is to figure out how do we, as public interest lawyers, adapt to this new environment, and how do we find a future as practicing lawyers where we can have viable careers. It's a tough, but I think Peter and Mary Ellen have sort of framed it exactly
Perfect. But just to comment on that very briefly, is that there is another phenomenon even at universities now, including my own law school, there is this corporatization of education. Everything needs a label on it. Everything requires a certain level of funding back from whatever you're putting in. And I'm supposed as a bureaucrat to be able to manage that. So I'm confessing to you what takes up 2/3 of my time. But if that's where our legal enterprise is going, legal education enterprise is going, and all the big law firms will turn up at my law school and they'll recruit the very best, okay? But we're actually creating a culture of believing, making them believe that there's only one kind of job you can do with a law degree. Right? And we fail if we don't show them more options. And here they're the idealist lawyers from around the world. This is what the LLM program was all about. You got people from around the world with a common vision and a common view to make a change. You're not going to be part of Wall Street law firms. But in South Africa, we find, I've changed that in my law school, I insist that non-governmental organizations come through, the Chapter 9 institutions come through, that now accounting firms come through because they like lawyers for some reason. More recently, that's a phenomenon we've discovered. But we sort of mix in the group. And suddenly the students are getting a bit confused by this and saying, well, there's a limited opportunity because firm X only takes so many. And we have to disabuse them of those kinds of opportunities. But they, at the same time, South Africans are caught in a bind. Certainly the black South African students caught in a bind. Because he or she needs their education as soon as possible to get into the workforce, to be able to then repay a range of loans that have been taken, and also what they call black tax in South Africa, which means to educate the rest of the extended family. It's an enormous burden. And it's frightening that there would be so much heaped on the young shoulders so early. And therefore